It was a calm afternoon above the Atlantic, the kind of flight where everything felt serene and predictable. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, gleaming in its airline livery, sliced gracefully through the endless blue sky. Inside, 256 passengers relaxed in their seats, unaware that their journey would soon turn into a fight for survival. The soft hum of the engines, the faint chatter of passengers, and the clinking of glasses in the galley created a peaceful rhythm that defined long-haul flights. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Walker, a veteran pilot with more than 20 years of flying experience, sat confidently at the controls. Beside him was First Officer Daniel Hughes, younger but highly capable, monitoring the aircraft's systems. Everything on the digital flight displays glowed green, indicating a smooth cruise at 30,000 feet. The weather was perfect, visibility endless, and there wasn't even the slightest sign of turbulence. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisles, serving lunch trays and drinks. Families watched movies, business travelers typed quietly on laptops, and a few passengers napped beneath their blankets. Among them was a young woman named Emily Carter, just 20 years old, seated near the middle of the aircraft. She was a student pilot from London, heading to New York for a short aviation workshop, a dream trip that was supposed to inspire her to pursue a full commercial license one day. Emily had always loved flying. As a child, she'd pressed her face against airport windows just to watch planes take off. Now, as the aircraft hummed steadily through the sky, she looked out over the vast ocean, lost in thought. She admired how smoothly the Dreamliner glided, how powerful yet graceful it felt. She wondered if she would ever fly something so massive. But her thoughts were cut short in an instant. A deafening boom ripped through the cabin like a thunderclap. The plane jolted violently to the left, and passengers screamed as drinks and trays went flying. The calm sky turned into chaos within seconds. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a hiss, and the aircraft trembled as if caught in an invisible storm. Emily's heart raced. She looked out the window and saw something horrifying. The right engine was spewing fire and debris, pieces of metal breaking away into the sky. A column of smoke streamed behind the wing as the aircraft began to lose altitude. The sound of the remaining engine straining filled the cabin. In the cockpit, alarms blared, red warning lights flashing across the instrument panels. "Engine 2 failure. Fire detected," shouted Daniel. Captain Walker immediately grabbed the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 472, engine failure, declaring emergency." He called into the radio, but the static-laced transmission barely got through. Inside the cabin, oxygen masks dangled as terrified passengers struggled to breathe. Mothers clutched their children. A businessman cried out in panic. The once orderly cabin was now a scene of confusion and terror. Flight attendants tried to maintain order, shouting instructions over the noise, but even they struggled to keep calm. The aircraft suddenly dipped, sending a wave of fear through everyone on board. The pressure changed, and ears popped painfully. Loose objects rolled down the aisles as the plane began to descend rapidly. Emily gripped the armrest, her pilot instincts kicking in. She knew the feeling of a stall, and this was dangerously close. In the cockpit, Captain Walker fought to keep the plane level. "Fire switch activated, shutting down engine 2, he said, pulling the handle to cut off fuel supply. But the fire warning still flashed. "It's not extinguishing," Daniel shouted. Thick smoke started to seep into the cockpit through the ventilation system. The captain coughed, covering his mouth with a handkerchief. He reached for the emergency oxygen, but his movements slowed. The smoke was spreading faster than expected. "Try to divert to the nearest airport," he said, his voice strained. Daniel quickly scanned the navigation map, selecting a possible diversion point, Shannon Airport in Ireland, still hundreds of miles away. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing an engine malfunction. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. The situation is under control." His voice tried to sound calm, but Emily could hear the tension behind it. She knew from her flight training that such engine failures rarely ended smoothly when one system after another began to fail. A few minutes later, the lights flickered. The backup power systems kicked in. Emily's eyes darted toward the flight attendants, who were whispering among themselves, their faces pale. Something was very wrong. The crew looked scared too. Then, another jolt shook the aircraft. The left engine sputtered, coughing black smoke for a moment before stabilizing. The cabin filled with gasps. Emily felt the familiar pitch of descent increase. The plane was dropping faster now. Back in the cockpit, Captain Walker's breathing grew shallow. The thick smoke from the burning wires and insulation made it almost impossible to see clearly. His vision blurred, and within moments, he slumped sideways, unconscious. "Captain, Captain," Daniel shouted, shaking him, but the captain didn't respond. Panic set in. The cockpit alarms continued to beep relentlessly, stall warning, altitude drop, as Daniel tried to manage the controls alone. The intercom fell silent for a long, chilling moment. Passengers looked at each other, sensing something terrible had happened up front. One woman began praying aloud, while others clung to each other. Emily's pulse pounded. She could feel the aircraft banking unevenly. The co-pilot must be struggling alone, she thought. Her brain raced through her limited training. She'd practiced emergency procedures on small Cessna planes, but never anything like this. Yet she knew enough to recognize that time was running out. A faint smell of burning plastic reached her seat. The cabin lights dimmed again. The air inside felt heavy and hot. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the seatbelt sign and shouts from the attendants. "I need to help," she yelled, her voice steady despite her fear. "Ma'am, please sit down," one attendant said, but Emily held up her student pilot ID. "I'm a pilot trainee, I can help them in the cockpit," she insisted. The attendant hesitated. They were trained to follow strict rules, but this was no ordinary emergency. The screams of passengers and the violent shaking of the plane left no time for hesitation. "Go," the attendant finally said, pointing her toward the cockpit door. Emily ran down the aisle, bracing herself against the seats as the plane jolted. The door to the cockpit was half open, the smoke pouring out. She coughed as she stepped inside. The captain was slumped over his seat, unconscious, while the first officer struggled alone, sweat dripping down his face as he fought to keep the plane steady. "What's your experience?" Daniel shouted, his eyes darting between the controls and her. "I'm a student pilot, 70 hours, mostly Cessna 172. But I know basic instrument flight," she replied quickly. He looked at her for a split second, fear in his eyes, but also relief that someone was there. "All right," he said, "take the co-pilot's side, help me keep her level." Emily slid into the seat, her heart pounding. The feel of the 787's controls was far heavier than anything she'd touched before, but instinct took over. She grabbed the yoke gently, feeling the resistance, and began to correct the pitch as Daniel adjusted the power on the remaining engine. Good, hold it steady," he said. Emily's hands trembled, but she focused on the instruments, the artificial horizon, the speed indicator, the altitude. They were losing height too fast. "We're descending at over 3,000 feet per minute, she said. "I know," Daniel muttered. "We need to reduce drag, flaps up slightly." She nodded and reached for the flap lever. The aircraft responded sluggishly but started to level out. "Okay, that's it," he said. "Now, keep her steady at 230 heading." Emily kept her eyes fixed on the horizon indicator, her breathing shallow but steady. The cabin still shook, and the right side of the plane burned faintly in the distance. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly below, cold, unforgiving. If they couldn't hold altitude, they would have to ditch in the sea. But she didn't think about that. She focused only on the numbers and the sounds of the engines. Meanwhile, the cabin behind them had grown eerily silent. The passengers sensed something was happening, something uncertain, yet somehow hopeful. Back in the cockpit, Daniel managed to get a weak radio signal. "Mayday, this is Flight 472, engine failure, captain incapacitated, request emergency descent and diversion." Static. Then a faint reply. "Flight 472, radar contact, proceed to Shannon, repeat, Shannon Airport, emergency runway prepared." Emily exhaled shakily. "We can make it," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it yet. The smoke began to clear slightly as the damaged system stabilized. The aircraft continued its descent, now under semi-control, though danger still loomed. Emily's arms ached from holding the yoke so tightly. She glanced at the unconscious captain beside her and then back to Daniel, who gave her a nod of gratitude. "You're doing great," he said quietly. "You just might save us." For Emily, it didn't feel like heroism. It felt like survival. Behind her, 256 souls depended on every small correction she made, every ounce of calm she could maintain. The 20-year-old student pilot who had boarded the plane as a dreamer was now part of a fight to keep it in the sky. And high above the Atlantic, as the crippled Boeing 787 fought to stay airborne, Emily Carter realized that courage isn't about confidence, it's about doing what you must when fear leaves you no choice. The story of that calm afternoon flight was no longer calm. It had become a test of human instinct, skill, and bravery, one that was only just beginning. Among the passengers, 20-year-old Emily Carter sat in seat 17A, her hands still trembling from the violent explosion that had shaken the aircraft moments earlier. The once smooth hum of the engines had turned into an uneven growl, and the cabin's atmosphere was thick with fear. The Boeing 787 was descending, shuddering, and every second felt like an eternity. Emily's heart raced, but her mind tried to focus. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a student pilot. Though she had only 70 hours of flight training, she understood enough to know how critical the situation was. One engine had failed, and now, the aircraft was unstable. The passengers around her were screaming, praying, and crying, but Emily's eyes darted toward the front of the cabin. Something told her she couldn't just sit there. As the oxygen mask swayed and the lights flickered, Emily took a deep breath. Her instinct screamed that she had to do something. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The seatbelt sign glowed red, and a flight attendant immediately noticed her movement. "Ma'am, please remain seated." The attendant shouted over the roar of the wind and the sound of alarms echoing faintly through the cabin. But Emily's voice was firm, even though her heart was pounding. "I'm a pilot trainee, I can help them in the cockpit." The flight attendant hesitated, unsure of what to do. The standard protocol was clear. No passengers were allowed into the cockpit during flight, especially not in an emergency. But this wasn't a normal flight anymore. The entire aircraft was shaking, and the captain had gone silent over the intercom. The attendant's training told her to maintain order, but her instincts told her that this young woman's determination was something different. Emily's eyes burned with focus, not panic. After a tense moment, the attendant nodded, her own hands trembling. "Go," she said, motioning Emily forward. Emily pushed past terrified passengers clutching their armrests and crying out for help. The sound of the alarms grew louder as she moved toward the cockpit. She could smell the acrid scent of burnt plastic and wiring. Her shoes slipped slightly on the floor as the plane jolted again, but she caught herself on the seats. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of every passenger's hope pressed down on her shoulders. When she reached the cockpit door, she saw that it was half open, a thin haze of gray smoke seeping out. Her throat tightened as she stepped inside. The scene was chaos. The captain was slumped over, unconscious, his oxygen mask hanging uselessly from his face. The first officer, Daniel Hughes, was drenched in sweat, his hands gripping the controls tightly as he fought to keep the aircraft level. Warning lights flashed across the control panels, painting the cockpit in shades of red and orange. Daniel glanced up, startled to see someone entering. "You can't be here," he shouted. His voice was raw with stress. "I can help," Emily yelled back, coughing from the smoke. "I'm a student pilot, 70 hours in a Cessna 172. Please, let me help." Daniel's eyes darted between her and the instruments. For a second, he hesitated, caught between rules and desperation. The plane shook violently again, and that hesitation vanished. "Fine," he said. "Sit down," co-pilot sighed. "Help me keep her level." Emily slid into the right seat. The yoke in front of her looked massive compared to what she was used to. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around it. The control felt heavy, responsive to the slightest movement, but she forced herself to stay steady. "What's our status?" she asked quickly. "Engine 2's gone," Daniel replied, his voice strained. "We've shut it down, but the fire warning won't clear. We're losing altitude, 3,000 feet per minute. Autopilot's dead, we're flying manual." Emily glanced at the instruments. The altimeter needle was spinning downward far too fast. The artificial horizon tilted slightly to the left. "We're banking," she said. "I know, I'm trying to correct it," Daniel muttered, wrestling with the yoke. "Let me help," she said. Together, they eased the controls, trying to find balance. The aircraft responded sluggishly, like a wounded animal. Emily's arms ached from the effort, but slowly, the nose began to level. "That's it," Daniel said. "Good, hold her steady." Emily focused on the instruments. The numbers blurred slightly through the haze of smoke, but she locked onto the artificial horizon, keeping it centered. Her mind raced back to her training: maintain altitude, control pitch, manage airspeed. Even though this was a completely different aircraft, the fundamentals were the same. "Speed's dropping," she warned. "Yeah, I see it," Daniel replied. "We can't afford to stall. Increase thrust on the left engine, gently." Emily reached for the throttle, her fingers trembling. She pushed it slightly forward, feeling the deep vibration of the single working engine as it responded. The aircraft steadied a little more. The radio crackled faintly. Daniel tried to communicate with air traffic control again. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 472, engine failure, captain incapacitated, requesting emergency assistance. The response came through static, faint but audible. Flight 472, we copy you. Divert to Shannon Airport, emergency runway prepared, maintain altitude if possible. Daniel exhaled, relief flickering in his eyes. Shannon's our best bet, if we can make it. Emily nodded. We will, she said quietly, though she could feel her pulse in her throat. She knew that crossing hundreds of miles on one engine was a near impossible task, but she refused to give up. Smoke curled above the control panels. The acrid smell burned her lungs, but she stayed focused. She adjusted the trim, trying to reduce the pressure on the yoke. Every small movement mattered. One wrong correction could send them into a spiral. Daniel glanced at her, his voice softer now. You're doing great. Emily didn't answer. She was too focused, too determined to let herself feel anything. Fear was still there, deep inside her, but it was buried under a stronger instinct, the need to survive. Minutes passed like hours. The cockpit was hot, the oxygen masks pressing tightly against their faces. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly below them, gray and vast. Emily couldn't help but glance at it for a second. If they lost control again, that ocean would be their only landing surface. She pushed the thought away. Altitude 25,000 and holding, Daniel said, checking the instruments. Good work. Emily exhaled shakily. The plane was still trembling, but for the first time since the explosion, it felt stable. Behind them, the cabin was eerily quiet. The passengers didn't know exactly what was happening, but they could feel a change. The descent had slowed. Some dared to look out the windows again. A few whispered prayers of gratitude, unaware that the calm was being maintained by a 20-year-old girl who had stepped into the cockpit out of pure courage. Emily's arms ached, but she didn't relax. What about the fire? She asked. It's still flagged, Daniel said, glancing at the engine indicators. But I think the system's giving a false signal now. Temperature's dropping. She nodded, relieved. Okay, let's focus on heading. They adjusted the course toward Shannon, recalculating fuel and distance. Every decision mattered. Daniel managed the radios while Emily kept her eyes fixed on the horizon and the instruments. The seconds turned into minutes. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and her heart still raced, but her hands were steady. For the first time since the explosion, she believed they had a chance. Emily, Daniel said suddenly, you're saving this plane. She looked at him, surprised by the words. We're saving it, she said quietly. He smiled faintly, though exhaustion lined his face. You know, I've flown with captains who didn't stay this calm under pressure. Emily allowed herself a small breath of relief. Don't say that yet, we still have to land this thing. Daniel nodded. Yeah, one step at a time. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and sunlight broke through the haze, casting a soft glow over the ocean below. It looked peaceful again, as if the chaos that had erupted moments ago was just a nightmare. But Emily knew better. They were still hundreds of miles from safety, still one malfunction away from disaster. Yet, in that moment, she felt something powerful rising inside her: focus, courage, and a strange sense of calm. The fear that had gripped her at the start of the flight had transformed into determination. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was part of the crew, part of the fight to keep this massive machine in the air. The first officer looked at her again, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. Let's get these people home. Emily nodded, tightening her grip on the controls. Let's do it. As the Boeing 787 continued its flight across the Atlantic, one engine gone, its passengers unaware of the young woman guiding them through the sky, a quiet heroism filled the cockpit. The sound of alarms had faded, replaced by the rhythmic hum of the surviving engine. In that fragile moment, Emily Carter proved that courage isn't measured by experience or age, it's found in the heart of someone who refuses to give up when everything seems lost. And though the journey was far from over, she had already done something extraordinary. She had given hope to an entire plane of terrified souls, showing them that even at 30,000 feet, surrounded by fear and chaos, bravery could still rise above the clouds. Emily's hands were tight on the yoke, her knuckles pale under the glow of the instrument lights. The Boeing 787 trembled but held steady as the two of them fought against the odds. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath them, cold and gray, like a reminder of what awaited if they failed. The radio hissed occasionally, fragments of instructions breaking through from air traffic control, but most of the communication was fading in and out. The aircraft's electrical systems were damaged, and both pilots knew they were flying on borrowed time. Daniel glanced at the flight displays. We've stabilized, but we're still losing fuel faster than normal. The right-wing tank's pressure is dropping. His voice was hoarse, the weight of exhaustion pressing on every word. Emily leaned forward, scanning the gauges. Could it be a leak from the explosion? She asked, her voice controlled but tense. Maybe, Daniel said, adjusting a few switches, but we can't confirm without the full diagnostic system, and that's offline. Emily felt a rush of unease. Every light, every sound, every vibration felt magnified in that confined space. The aircraft creaked, groaned, and shuddered against the wind. The damaged engine on the right side still glowed faintly orange, its housing charred and smoking. Even with the fire mostly extinguished, the sight of it filled her with dread. Altitude holding at 23,000, Daniel said, glancing at her. Good job keeping it level. Emily nodded, her face pale but focused. I'm trimming slightly nose up to maintain lift. The left engine's struggling a bit. Copy that, he said. Just keep it smooth. The minutes crawled by. The cabin behind them remained eerily silent except for the occasional sob or whisper. Passengers clutched hands, prayed, and waited, not knowing that a 20-year-old student was part of the crew saving their lives. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, checking on people, their faces pale but calm. Every eye looked forward, toward the sealed cockpit, wondering if anyone was still in control. Inside, Emily's focus never wavered. She was sweating under the strain, but her breathing remained steady. She could feel every movement of the plane through the yoke, every tremor of turbulence echoing through her arms. We're drifting off heading, she said suddenly. Daniel checked the navigation display. Yeah, crosswinds from the north. Adjust 5 degrees right, she nudged the control gently. The aircraft responded sluggishly but obeyed. Heading 235 corrected, she said. Perfect, he replied. You've got good instincts. Emily didn't smile. She couldn't afford to. How long to Shannon? She asked instead. About 35 minutes if we maintain speed. But we've got weather forming ahead, reports of turbulence and low visibility near the coast. Of course there would be. Nothing about this flight was going to be easy. Emily stared at the horizon, where dark clouds loomed in the distance. If we hit turbulence, this engine won't hold long, she said. I know, Daniel replied quietly. But that's our only option. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit except for the rhythmic drone of the single working engine. The steady vibration of it was both a comfort and a warning, one engine, one chance. Emily could feel the weight of every soul behind her pressing down on her shoulders. Suddenly, a new alarm pierced the air, a shrill, repeating tone that made her heart jump. What is that? She asked, eyes darting across the panel. Hydraulic pressure warning, Daniel said, his jaw tightening. System B's dropping. We might lose control authority on the right aileron. Emily's stomach dropped. Can we compensate? Maybe. We've still got System A. And partial redundancy, he replied. But control's going to get heavier. Already, Emily could feel it, the yoke resisted her touch, stiffer, slower to respond. She gritted her teeth and focused. I've got it, she said. I can handle it. Daniel looked at her, impressed by her composure. You sure you're only 20? He asked, trying to cut the tension. Emily almost smiled, but her eyes stayed fixed on the instruments. Feels like 40 right now. They both let out a short, nervous laugh. Even in crisis, that tiny moment of humor helped them breathe again. The turbulence started soon after. The nose of the plane bounced slightly, and loose items rattled in the cockpit. Emily tightened her grip, her movements controlled but precise. The plane jolted suddenly to the left, and she countered instinctively, keeping the wings level. Daniel monitored engine parameters while calling out headings. You're doing great, he said again, his voice firmer now. Emily nodded, every muscle in her body tense. The turbulence worsened, and outside the windows, lightning flashed in the distance. The entire aircraft shook, but the two in the cockpit moved like one. Every adjustment she made, Daniel backed it up. Every correction he called, she responded instantly. Altitude 21,000, Daniel said. Hold it here. Copy, Emily said, adjusting trim. The clouds thickened, gray and swirling. Rain streaked across the windshield, and thunder rolled somewhere far below them. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The cockpit lights reflected off the mist, creating an eerie glow. For a moment, Emily felt a flash of fear. She had flown through clouds before, but never something like this, never at the controls of a massive passenger jet fighting to survive. She thought of her instructor back home, of the simulator sessions where he'd said, "You'll never really know what you're capable of until the sky tests you." Now she knew what he meant. The radio crackled again, faint but clear enough. "Flight 472, you are cleared direct to Shannon. Emergency services are on standby. Weather moderate to severe. Do you copy?" Daniel pressed the transmitter. "Roger, Shannon, we copy. One engine, partial hydraulics, captain incapacitated. Estimating 30 minutes to approach." Static answered, but at least they were in contact. Emily exhaled, trying to calm her racing heart. The turbulence eased slightly. For a few minutes, the aircraft found a strange rhythm again, cutting through the sky like a wounded bird still fighting to reach home. "How's your arm?" Daniel asked quietly. "Feels like it's made of stone," she said, half laughing, half groaning. "You can ease up a little. You've got good control." "I'm fine," she said, adjusting the throttle slightly. "Just don't let go." He didn't. They flew in silence for a while, both knowing that even the smallest mistake could undo everything they had fought for. Then, through the clouds, the faint outline of the Irish coastline appeared on the radar. Daniel pointed to the display. "There it is, we're getting close." Emily's heart leapt. Finally. "Don't celebrate yet," he warned. "We've still got to land her." She nodded. "Let's plan the approach." Daniel opened the chart on his display. "Runway 24, length long enough for a Dreamliner. We'll need a low-speed approach. Flaps 20, gear down early in case hydraulics fail completely." "Got it," she said. "Speed target, 180 on descent, 140 final approach." Emily memorized the numbers. "Copy." The clouds began to break in patches, revealing glimpses of land far below. The passengers gasped when they saw it: green fields, a river, and the faint shimmer of civilization. Hope spread quietly through the cabin. In the cockpit, Emily focused on the instruments again. The smell of burnt wiring still lingered, and her hands were trembling from exhaustion, but her mind was sharp. Every sound, every flicker of movement mattered. The plane dipped slightly again, and she countered immediately. "Still losing some control on the right," she said. "Just keep your inputs small. Don't fight it too much," Daniel replied. "She'll follow your lead." The storm clouds thinned as they descended. Through the windshield, Emily could finally see a faint line of runway lights in the far distance, blurred by mist. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Daniel looked at her and smiled, though his eyes were tired. "That's home," he said softly. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Let's bring them down safe." She adjusted the trim once more, steadying the nose. The aircraft rumbled, the left engine roaring as it carried the massive jet toward safety. Below them, emergency vehicles were already lining the runway, their flashing lights glimmering faintly through the fog. Shannon Airport was ready, waiting for a miracle to arrive from the clouds. Inside the cockpit, Emily and Daniel prepared for the most critical part of the flight, the landing. Neither spoke much. Words weren't needed anymore. They knew what had to be done. And as the Boeing 787 began its final descent, the passengers, unaware of the details but feeling the calm return to the air, began to whisper prayers of gratitude and disbelief. The young woman who had once sat quietly in seat 17A was now flying their plane. And though she didn't think of herself as a hero, Emily Carter had already done something few ever could. She had taken control in chaos, fought fear with focus, and turned the impossible into a chance at survival. The sky still roared outside, but inside that cockpit, courage had found its place among the clouds. The runway lights shimmered through the mist like a distant promise as the crippled Boeing 787 roared over the Irish coastline. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears, her hands locked on the yoke, guiding the enormous aircraft through the thick gray clouds. The rain streaked down the windshield, and thunder echoed faintly behind them. The left engine groaned under the strain, but it kept pushing, a single heartbeat keeping more than 200 lives in the sky. Shannon Airport was only minutes away now, but every mile felt endless. Daniel's voice broke the heavy silence in the cockpit. "We're cleared to land on runway 24. Weather's rough, crosswinds from the southwest, about 15 knots. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the exhaustion beneath. He looked at the unconscious captain slumped beside them, then back at Emily. "You ready for this?" Emily swallowed hard. "I'm ready." She wasn't sure if it was courage or adrenaline keeping her focused, but fear had no space left in her mind. The only thing that mattered was getting everyone safely to the ground. The altimeter ticked down, 12,000 feet, then 10,000. The runway lights grew brighter through the haze, glowing like a path out of a nightmare. "Okay," Daniel said, adjusting a few switches. "Gear down." Emily reached for the lever and pulled it. The familiar sound of hydraulics groaned, followed by a heavy clunk. "Main gear locked," she said. "Nose gear, wait." Her heart skipped. The indicator light flickered uncertainly before turning green. "Nose gear locked," she confirmed with relief. "Good," Daniel replied. "Flaps 20. She set the flaps. The plane shook slightly as the drag increased, but the controls held. "Speed 160, she said. "Maintain it," Daniel answered. "We'll take it slow." The cockpit was filled with the constant rhythm of the alarms, the beeping and the hum of the remaining systems trying to keep up. The aircraft trembled as turbulence rocked it from side to side. Emily corrected quickly, her every movement small and controlled. The yoke felt like a living thing under her hands, heavy and unpredictable. She gritted her teeth and held on. Daniel glanced at her again. "We're lined up perfectly. You've got this." Emily exhaled slowly, her voice low and calm. "I can do this." At 5,000 feet, the clouds broke open just enough to reveal the runway fully ahead. It was long and wet, bordered by flashing lights and emergency vehicles already in place. Fire trucks and ambulances waited like silent sentinels along the edges. The people below could see the massive airliner approaching, one engine dead, smoke trailing faintly from its right wing. "Approach looks good," Daniel said, his tone shifting to command mode. "Sync rate manageable. Keep it gentle." "Speed 155, Emily replied. Adjusting trim. The wind buffeted the aircraft, making it sway. Emily felt the nose dip slightly and corrected instantly. The plane steadied, gliding through the final approach corridor. Her eyes never left the instruments, then the runway, then back again, over and over in perfect rhythm. 3,000 feet, Daniel called. "Copy," she said softly. "Flaps 30, he said. She reached for the lever again, and the plane responded with a deep vibration. The descent angle steepened slightly. The wipers squealed against the windshield as sheets of rain lashed the glass. Emily's breath fogged inside her mask, but she didn't dare wipe it. Every second mattered now. 2,000, Daniel said, his voice rising slightly. "Looking good, Emily. Keep her centered." The runway lights grew larger, the ground racing up to meet them. The passengers behind them held their breath, gripping armrests and praying. Some whispered to their loved ones. Some closed their eyes, and somewhere in the back, a flight attendant clasped her hands together, whispering, "Please, God, let them land." Emily's eyes flicked to the altimeter. 1,000. "Stabilized," Daniel said. "You're perfect. Just a little more throttle." She adjusted the power slightly, feeling the thrust push back against the drag. The aircraft's nose lifted just enough to smooth the descent. 500, Daniel said. "Slight crosswind. Correct left." Emily turned the yoke gently, aligning the nose with the runway. The massive aircraft obeyed, tilting slightly, then straightening beautifully. The runway lights stretched out like a landing guide into the rain. 200, Daniel called, his voice now calm, trusting. "Speed 140, Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hold it," he said. "Flare at 100. The rain hammered harder, and the wind pushed once more. Emily countered. Her entire world was narrowed to that stretch of runway and the soft hum of the single remaining engine. 100, Daniel said quietly. Emily eased back on the yoke, her movements smooth, deliberate. The nose lifted slightly, the descent slowed, the wheels hovered just above the wet tarmac. Then, with a deep, resonant thud, the main landing gear touched down. The aircraft bounced once, then settled heavily on the runway. A massive cheer erupted from the cabin behind them, but Emily didn't hear it yet. Her focus stayed locked on the controls. "Reverse thrust," Daniel said. "Engaging," Emily replied. She deployed the reversers, the roar filling the cockpit as the aircraft decelerated rapidly. Spray from the wet runway flew past the windows. "Speed 90 knots, Daniel called. "Keep her centered." Emily adjusted the rudder pedals, keeping the jet perfectly aligned despite the crosswinds. Her arms burned with the effort, her eyes never leaving the centerline. 70 knots, Daniel said. Emily began easing back the throttles. 60. The aircraft slowed, its massive weight pressing down as the sound of the engine faded to a low hum. 40 knots, Daniel said softly. "We're down." For a few seconds, silence filled the cockpit. The alarms stopped. The rumble of the wheels softened. The impossible had happened. They had landed. Emily slowly lifted her hands from the controls, her fingers trembling. She looked out the windshield and saw flashing red and blue lights racing toward them. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency crews were already on the runway, forming a ring around the plane. Daniel turned to her, his voice filled with awe. "You did it." Emily blinked, barely believing it. "We did it," she said quietly. The intercom crackled. A flight attendant's voice came through, shaky but joyous. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely." The cabin erupted in cheers and sobs. Passengers hugged each other, strangers cried together. Some clapped, some prayed. The relief was overwhelming. Emily sat back, her body shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked at the unconscious captain beside her, then at Daniel. "We need medical help for him," she said. "Already called in," Daniel replied, glancing out the window where medics were approaching with stretchers. As the engines wound down, the cockpit filled with the faint hum of cooling systems and the smell of smoke. Emily removed her oxygen mask and took a deep breath. The air was heavy but real, Earth air, not sky air. She had never been so grateful for it. A few minutes later, the emergency crew opened the cockpit door. The bright daylight and flashing lights poured in. Paramedics rushed to the captain, while others began checking the passengers. One of the flight attendants entered, her eyes wide and glistening. "Everyone's safe," she said, her voice trembling. "Because of you." Emily shook her head, still processing everything. "We all made it happen," she said softly. When she finally stepped out of the cockpit, the cabin erupted into applause. Passengers stood, clapping and crying as she walked past. Some reached out to touch her shoulder, to thank her. Emily blushed, overwhelmed. She wasn't used to attention, she had just done what she thought needed to be done. Outside, the news cameras were already gathering. The story of the young student pilot who helped land a crippled Dreamliner had spread like wildfire. Within hours, the world would know her name. But in that moment, none of that mattered to her. She looked up at the cloudy sky and felt tears sting her eyes. She had flown through fear, through fire, through the edge of disaster, and made it home. Later, when reporters asked her how she found the courage, she simply said, "I didn't think about fear. I just thought about flying." The image of that Boeing 787 sitting safely on the tarmac, smoke rising gently from its damaged engine, became a symbol of hope and bravery around the world. Emily Carter, the 20-year-old student pilot who saved hundreds of lives at 30,000 feet, reminded everyone that heroes aren't born in calm moments, they're forged in the storm. And as she stood by the runway that day, watching the aircraft that had nearly fallen from the sky, Emily smiled faintly, the adrenaline finally giving way to quiet disbelief. She had done the